You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music.
On the morning of December 18th, 2020, 50-year-old Brooke Stroud wandered into her spacious kitchen in Washington, D.C., where she lived with her husband, Stefan, and their 3 young adult children. Brooke shook her head and tried to concentrate as she searched for the cup of coffee she'd brewed earlier. She hadn't been herself the last few days. Her head felt foggy, and little things, like where she'd put her coffee, had been slipping her mind. Brooke spotted the cup in a corner right near their large Viking stove. She grabbed it and headed out of the kitchen and into the formal living room. She slipped on a jacket and went out to the backyard, making a beeline for the separate guest house where she'd set up a home office. It was 9 months into the COVID-19 pandemic, and most businesses all over the country were shut down. Brooke was a clinical psychologist, and she had switched all her in-person sessions to Zoom. This morning, she had a group call, so she set her mug down at her wooden desk, turned on her laptop, and logged into her meeting. As Brooke said hello to the other participants, a wave of exhaustion suddenly washed over her. Her head felt heavy, and every bone in her body was suddenly aching. A scary thought crossed Brooke's mind. Maybe she'd finally gotten COVID, a disease that had already killed 350,000 people in the United States alone. She tried to power through the meeting, but all she could think about was how awful she felt. And so after only a few minutes of being in this meeting, she told everybody on the call that she just wasn't feeling well and asked if they could actually reschedule. After logging out of the Zoom call, Brooke took a minute to collect herself. She didn't think her symptoms seemed like COVID, so she wondered if maybe she was just overdoing it and was maybe tired from the stress of her job. She loved her work, but her hours have been crazy since the pandemic started. More people than ever were turning to therapy to get through these very difficult times. So she decided to cancel the rest of her sessions for the day and just go get some rest. She took the familiar path out of the guest house, through the backyard, and into the main house, walking more slowly than usual. Brooke climbed the winding staircase up to the second floor and into the master bedroom. There she climbed into bed, hoping to sleep off her weariness. Hours later, around noon, Brooke blinked her eyes open. Groggily, she sat up and felt around the bed. Her crisp white sheets were now totally damp with sweat. Brooke touched her forehead and realized she was burning up. She stumbled out of her bed and into the bathroom to take her temperature, and she saw it was 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and so she knew she was officially sick. Brooke tried to figure out what to do. She needed to get herself tested for COVID as soon as possible, but at-home COVID tests were not available at this time, which meant she'd have to set up an appointment with her doctor. Until she had the results, she could stay in her bedroom to avoid infecting her family potentially, but then she realized it was likely too late to actually isolate herself. Her youngest kids, 19-year-old Alex and 17-year-old Olivia, had come home from college and boarding school for the holidays a few days earlier, and they were probably already exposed to whatever Brooke had. So she decided it likely made the most sense to just kind of go about her day as usual, but at the same time, try to keep her distance from the kids and her husband. So Brooke put her hair up in a messy bun and headed downstairs. A few hours later, Brooke gathered everyone for dinner. She sat at one end of their long table, while Stefan and the kids were at the other. Brooke wasn't up to cooking, so she ordered takeout from an Italian place, and the table was overflowing with pastas and salads. Alex and Olivia piled their plates high. They always had big appetites when they came home after months of school cafeteria food. Brooke was glad to see her kids eating, but for her, her fever was still burning, and she felt barely hungry at all. She pushed her pasta around her plate as her kids talked about what their semesters had been like with all the COVID protocols. Alex went to college in North Carolina, and Olivia was a high school senior at the same all-girls boarding school in Virginia that Brooke had actually attended. Brooke's oldest child, Sebastian, went to college in Vermont and wouldn't be home for a few days. Brooke really hoped she'd feel better by then, so they could all spend the holidays together, stress-free. Alex looked excited as he told them all about school, but Brooke could see the sadness in Olivia's eyes as she talked about the way COVID restrictions had basically ruined campus life. Normally, she played on a few different sports teams, but the pandemic had put all of them on hold. Brooke felt sorry for Olivia. Even though the pandemic was hurting everybody, she knew her daughter was having an especially hard time. She had looked forward to being a senior for so long, and now that she was, everything seemed to be falling apart. But Brooke's job was to be Olivia's mom, not her therapist, and they were all trying to figure out how to adjust to this new normal. After everyone was done eating, Brooke suggested they watch an old Christmas movie. Brooke took a seat at the opposite end of the couch from Stefan and the kids, and then willed herself to stay awake. Even after napping for several hours that day, she was still exhausted. About halfway through the movie, Brooke noticed her husband massaging his temples, and he also had a strained look on his face. She asked him what was wrong, and he explained his head was pounding. Brooke suggested he go check his temperature. Maybe he had a fever too. They paused the TV, and Stefan headed upstairs, holding onto the banister for support. A few minutes later, Brooke heard him vomiting. So she mustered what little strength she had left and ran up to find him leaning over the toilet bowl. She rubbed Stefan's back, trying to soothe him, but then she heard Alex and Olivia yell for her. Brooke told her husband she'd be right back, and she retraced her footsteps back to the living room. There, she found Alex and Olivia lying on the couch, clutching their heads in their hands as well. They complained that they also had terrible headaches. Brooke turned to go get them some water from the kitchen, while Alex shot up from the couch and ran to the guest bathroom. A second later, Brooke heard him retching too. And as if on cue, Olivia started dry heaving as well. Brooke ran to the kitchen at this point and grabbed a trash can, and she made it back to the living room just in time to set the bin in front of her daughter as she threw up all of her dinner. The following afternoon, Brooke and Stefan sat next to each other inside of a small exam room at their family doctor's office. Brooke had woken up that morning feeling like she'd barely gotten any sleep, even though she'd slept through the entire night, and the rest of her family felt just as bad. So Brooke had decided to get herself and Stefan checked for COVID. Brooke pulled her mask down under her nose, leaving just enough room for the nurse to insert a long nasal swab into her left nostril. It went so far back that it felt like Brooke's brain was being tickled. Her eyes teared up at the sensation, and she stifled a sneeze. The nurse rotated the swab around her nose for several seconds until it was coated with fluid, and then she repeated the same thing in Brooke's right nostril. And then she did the whole process all over again for Stefan. The nurse explained it would take about 24 hours for them to receive the test results by email. Then she took the swabs and left the room, while Brooke and Stefan checked out at the front desk. The next day, December 20th, 2020, Brooke stared at an email she had gotten from her doctor on her phone. She and Stefan were both negative for COVID, which was great, but they still felt horrible, and so clearly they were sick with something. Brooke decided to call Alex and Olivia's pediatrician to see if the kids should get tested for COVID too. But their doctor explained that it probably didn't make sense since Brooke and Stefan already tested negative. Whatever germs they had would have already infected the kids, but very, very likely it was not COVID. So the doctor recommended that everybody in the family just stay home, get some rest, drink lots of fluids, and surely this whole thing will just pass. However, a few days later, Brooke woke up aching all over still. Her fever had stayed steady at 100 degrees Fahrenheit, clouding her mind. The rest of her family felt just as bad too. Their headaches had never really gone away, and some mornings they still woke up feeling very nauseous. But Brooke fought through the fatigue and dragged herself out to her office in the guest house. She knew she was supposed to focus on resting and powering up her immune system, but she felt a responsibility to her clients. Her family was not the only one struggling right now during this weird holiday season. So Brooke settled in at her desk and logged into her first Zoom call. And as she took notes and chatted with other clients throughout the day, she felt herself perk up a bit. Slowly, her headache subsided, and the exhaustion that had usually overpowered her these last few days began to lift. Brooke thought about how good it felt to focus on other people for a change. Around 5 p.m., she wrapped up her sessions and made her way back to the house. She felt optimistic for the first time in a while that maybe she was finally getting over this illness. And so, Brooke, feeling really good, decided she would surprise the family by cooking a nice dinner. An hour later, Brooke called her whole family over to the dining room. She'd grilled some nice, thick steaks, figuring they could all use the protein. Brooke smiled as she doled out plates of food, silently telling herself that they would all be better by Christmas. She'd gotten sick before everybody else, so it made sense that she was recovering sooner too. But as Brooke took a bite of this food she made, she suddenly felt all that heaviness in her head and body start to creep back in. She told herself it was nothing, ignoring the queasiness that was growing in her stomach, and she managed to swallow a few bites of food before she just gave up. And she could see that the rest of her family also could not stomach their food either. Brooke watched Olivia push her salad around listlessly. She was usually so bubbly and full of life, but tonight, just like the rest of them, she looked defeated. Brooke sighed and began clearing their plates covered with uneaten food. After cleaning up, it took all the strength she had left just to shuffle upstairs and fall into her bed. The next afternoon, December 23rd, Brooke heard the front door open. She'd spent all morning in bed, but now she gathered the energy to limp down the stairs to the foyer, her muscles weak from this mystery illness and lack of physical activity. Her hair was matted, and she was wearing the same sweatpants and sweatshirt she'd been in for the past few days. But she managed a weak smile at the sight of her son, Sebastian, standing there with his duffel bag slung over his shoulder, finally home from his college in Vermont. He looked fit and healthy, the rosiness in his cheeks a stark contrast to the paleness of her own face. She'd warned Sebastian that his family was not feeling well, but he joked that, nobody was feeling well these days. After all, it's the pandemic. And he said he would rather get sick at home than spend the holidays somewhere else without his family. Brooke stood at the bottom step, trying to keep her distance from her son, even as she told him how happy she was that he was home. But Sebastian just laughed and pulled her into a big bear hug. Brooke allowed him to wrap his arms around her, a sense of relief washing over her. A few hours later, the whole family sat in the living room eating cheese and crackers, while Sebastian told them all about his fall semester at college. As he described the off-campus house where he lived, Brooke saw Sebastian slowly sink into the couch, and his voice started to sound fatigued. She asked him if he felt okay, and Sebastian said he was just tired from finishing up his last paper for school and then catching a flight home. Brooke smiled and suggested he go to his room and get some rest. But inside, Brooke started worrying that Sebastian might be coming down with this same mystery illness that was dogging the rest of them. A couple of days after Christmas, Brooke's daughter Olivia woke up with a throbbing headache just as she had every morning since coming home. Her muscles still ached and she still didn't feel rested at all. In fact, it felt like she could sleep for another 5 hours, and even that probably wouldn't be enough. Olivia looked around her room, noticing all the tissues and dirty clothes she had scattered on the carpet. Usually she kept her space very nice and tidy, but she didn't have the energy or motivation to clean or do much of anything, really. So far, her winter break had been a total disaster. Olivia had expected the holidays to be different because of the COVID pandemic, but she'd hoped to have at least some fun. Now, the only silver lining was her upcoming trip to visit Caroline, her best friend from school who lived in New Orleans. Then, the plan was for them to fly back to DC together and spend 2 more weeks in isolation at Olivia's house. Their boarding school wanted all students to quarantine before returning for the spring semester, so they were going to do that together in DC. But Olivia was now worried that the family's mystery illness could ruin her visit to Caroline's house too. So, Olivia asked her parents to please set up an appointment with her pediatrician that afternoon. If doctors could just figure out what was making her sick, maybe Olivia could get the right treatment in time to go visit her friend. The next day, Olivia sat down next to her very ragged-looking mom at the kitchen table. Brooke blew on the steaming cup of tea in front of her, cooling it down before taking a long sip. She had purple bags under her eyes and her hair was a total mess. Olivia obviously knew her mom was not feeling great, none of them were, but she needed her mom's attention right now. She gathered up her willpower, pushing away the nausea and exhaustion she felt, and reminded herself of the argument she'd practiced. She was determined to see her friend Caroline and get back to living her life. First, Olivia gave her mom a rundown of her visit to the pediatrician the previous day. Dr. Stein had given her a COVID test just to be safe. She also checked for parvovirus, which causes mild respiratory illness, and Epstein-Barr virus, a common illness that would be making Olivia very drowsy. Olivia explained to her mom that all the results had come back negative. Then, before Brooke could even respond, Olivia launched into the speech she'd prepared. She told her mother, since she didn't have any of those viruses or COVID, she should be able to go see Caroline. All she was doing here was sitting at the house and watching TV, and after saying this, Olivia just went quiet and watched her mom consider her words. She could see the wheels in her mother's mind turning, and for a moment, it seemed like her mom might actually agree with her. But before Olivia could celebrate her victory, her mom's face got serious, and she began to speak in a very soft voice. Brooke explained that she, Olivia, her daughter, was already sick, and she couldn't risk traveling and getting worse, even if she didn't know what the sickness was. Olivia immediately huffed in frustration and thought about arguing more with her mom, but as upsetting as this was, she knew her mom was right. She did feel terrible, and clearly whatever she had likely was contagious because her whole family had it. So Olivia turned and headed up the stairs to her bedroom, her breathing ragged and her spirits deflated. Brooke sighed as she heard Olivia kind of stomping around upstairs, obviously still very upset, and Brooke couldn't help but feel sorry for her teenage daughter. This holiday season wasn't what any of them were expecting, but it seemed like Olivia was really taking it the hardest. She thrived on interacting with people, and she had already been through a semester at school full of remote classes and social distancing because of COVID. This trip to New Orleans was supposed to be her big chance to go have some fun and explore a new city with a very close friend. Brooke wondered if there was anything she could do to salvage the rest of Olivia's break. She stood up from the couch, fighting off the dizziness that came whenever she moved too quickly, and just then a thought crossed her mind. Brooke grabbed her phone off the coffee table and made her way outside to the backyard and began looking through her contacts until she found the name John Schifflian, who was Caroline's dad. Brooke paced around the garden as she spoke to John, savoring the fresh air, and she explained to him what had been going on at her house and that unfortunately, Olivia was too sick to travel to New Orleans to see Caroline. Brooke was very clear that her whole family had the same bug as Olivia, and that doctors had been unable to figure out what it was, but they did eliminate COVID-19. It was not that. Then Brooke made her pitch to John. Instead of having her daughter Olivia fly to New Orleans, she suggested that Caroline come to stay with them in Washington, D.C. If Caroline came here, she and Olivia could spend time together and hole up in the house and do their required 2 weeks of quarantine before returning to school together. Now, Brooke knew that a lot of parents would immediately reject the idea of sending their child to a house where everybody is sick. But Caroline's father, John Schifflian, was no ordinary parent. He was an infectious disease specialist at Tulane University's medical school. He studied survivors of some of the world's worst infectious diseases, and probably had more information about COVID-19 than anyone else Brooke knew. And so if he was okay with Caroline coming to DC, Brooke was confident that it really was safe. After Brooke made her pitch, there was a few moments of awkward silence, and then John responded. It was widely understood that the longer somebody was sick, whether with COVID or something else, the less infectious the illness becomes to others. If Caroline visited, she likely wouldn't get sick at all, or she'd get a milder version of whatever Brooke's family had. Regardless, she wouldn't be in any significant danger. And also, John knew his daughter would totally go for this idea. She wanted to see her friend. And so ultimately, John agreed to the idea. Brooke thanked John and assured him that she'd do everything she could to make sure Caroline was safe. John thanked her, and then they hung up, and then Brooke practically ran into the house to tell her daughter the great news. A few days later, in early January of 2021, Brooke made her way to the front door of her house. Before she could reach for the handle, Olivia came bolting out of the kitchen and shooed her mom out of the way with more energy than Brooke had seen in weeks. Her daughter was practically jumping with excitement. Olivia threw open the door and immediately wrapped her arms around Caroline. As Brooke watched her daughter light up, she told herself this was the right decision. She turned to Caroline and told her she was welcome to take her mask off. She'd be here for the next 2 weeks anyway, and her dad was aware of the situation. Caroline and Olivia grinned at each other, then they took Caroline's bag and headed upstairs to Olivia's room. A few hours later, Brooke was sitting in the guest house catching up on her paperwork when her daughter Olivia came rushing inside. In a panicked voice, she explained that Caroline had a splitting headache and was currently in the bathroom throwing up. Brooke shot out of her chair, dizziness and anxiety bubbling up inside of her at the same time. Brooke couldn't believe what she'd done. She'd promised John that his daughter would be safe here. Now she was just as sick as the rest of them. Brooke followed Olivia out of the guest house and back to the main house, fighting off dizzying vertigo with every step. The next evening, on January 5th, 2021, Brooke stood outside the bedroom where Caroline was staying. She was trying to figure out if Caroline was asleep or not. Brooke gently knocked, and a few seconds later, Caroline opened up. Brooke realized that Caroline was actually on a video call on her phone, and she quickly apologized, saying she could come back later. But Caroline said don't worry about it, she was on the phone with her dad. Seizing the opportunity, Brooke asked if she could speak to him for a second. Caroline handed over the phone, and Brooke told John she was absolutely mortified at the way his daughter's visit had gone so far. She repeated the apologies she'd been giving Caroline ever since she got sick. But John just waved her apology away. He said it was okay, he'd been the one who signed off on this trip, and he knew that the whole family was sick. And so Brooke felt her anxiety ease a little bit. At least John was not openly blaming her for what was going on with Caroline. However, John wasn't quite finished with his response. He did want to call to Brooke's attention something that Caroline had brought up to him, something very important. Caroline had told him that her symptoms lessened whenever the girls went for a walk around the neighborhood. She also said that people seemed to get very sick very quickly when they came into the main house. That suggested to John that this was not an infectious disease. John thought it was much more likely that it was some kind of environmental illness, meaning there was something in the house doing it. And John actually had a sneaking suspicion about which environmental illness it was. So he recommended that Brooke go to the hardware store as soon as possible. There, she could buy a device that would prove John's theory. Brooke was shocked at what she was hearing, but she promised John she would go to the store first thing tomorrow morning, and then she passed the phone back to Caroline, anxious but excited that they might actually finally figure out what was making everybody sick. The next morning, January 6th, 2021, Stefan returned home from the hardware store with this new device in hand. Brooke grabbed her husband by the arm and rushed him inside, eager to see if Caroline's father had been right. She grabbed the device from Stefan and then hit the on button. And right away, the machine began blaring. The kids ran downstairs, shouting over the alarm to ask what was going on. Brooke pointed to the device and told Stefan to explain it to them as she fumbled with her phone. She very quickly dialed 911 and ran out into the yard, explaining to the dispatcher what was going on through panicked breaths. She pleaded with them to hurry. Within minutes, Brooke heard sirens. She rushed to the door and hurried the firefighters inside, showing them the device that was still going off. The uniformed men yelled over the alarm and instructed everyone to go outside and wait while they dealt with whatever was going on inside the house. Brooke ushered Stefan and the kids out the door and across the street. Pretty soon, curious neighbors were standing in small clusters all along the sidewalk, their eyes wide as they took in all the emergency vehicles before them. As they watched the commotion unfold, Brooke turned to Caroline and asked her to call her father. She wanted to tell John he was right. The firefighters would discover that Brooke's family had a serious carbon monoxide leak in their home, and everyone, including Caroline, had carbon monoxide poisoning. Carbon monoxide, or CO for short, is an odorless, colorless gas that kills hundreds of people every year. When somebody has carbon monoxide poisoning, what happens is the carbon monoxide in the air replaces the oxygen in their bloodstream. As a result, the heart, brain, and body are starved of the oxygen they need to survive. The firefighters who responded to Brooke's call quickly figured out that the leak was coming from the basement furnace. A clamp had come loose and was spewing carbon monoxide throughout the 4-story house. That explained why Brooke felt better every time she worked in the guest house, and why Olivia and Caroline had fewer symptoms whenever they were out walking around in the neighborhood. Brooke was shocked that their smoke alarm already in the home didn't warn them about the poisonous gas exposure, but after inspecting the alarm, she realized it didn't have a CO detector at all. It had been installed a year before Washington, D.C. required them in all residences. In the end, Brooke's family and Caroline all recovered well from the CO poisoning. After the leak, Brooke bought 4 plug-in detectors that she installed on each level of the house, but every time she goes into the basement, she can't help but check to see that the furnace is still properly connected.
In the early 1960s, 2 high school classmates in South Carolina, named Carol and Reggie, fell in love with each other. Every day in the halls, they'd hold hands and they'd laugh with each other and whisper to each other, and then outside of school, they were inseparable. But despite their seemingly perfect relationship, it didn't last long. They both had different ideas about what the future should hold, and so after graduation, they broke up. Reggie went on to join the US Navy, where he served for a number of years all over the world. He would at one point get married, but that marriage would end quickly, and then after he got out of the military, he got a job at a railroad back at his hometown in South Carolina. As for Carol, after graduation, she got married and divorced too, twice actually, but it was her second failed marriage that nearly killed her. On February 18th, 1987, Carol was living with her 10-year-old daughter Rhonda in South Carolina when her estranged second husband came up to the door and knocked. Carol opened the door, and her ex-husband drew a gun and shot her 6 times in front of her daughter before turning around and fleeing. The police would later find his body inside of his car on the side of the road. He had shot himself. As for Carol, the doctors were able to save her life, but the injuries she sustained from the attack were crippling. She was blind in one eye and she had chronic pain, and so her young daughter had to start taking care of her full time. Over the next 8 years, Carol steadily improved and regained some of her independence, but in 1995, she had a huge setback. She started feeling ill, and so she went in to see a doctor, and the doctor did a blood test, and they discovered she had liver cancer. It would turn out the blood that was given to her after the attack, that had been transfused into her body to save her life, it had been tainted with hepatitis C. And so she got hepatitis C without realizing it, and because it had been untreated, it led to liver cancer. Rhonda remembers when her mother came home after being given this terrible news, she just sat down and was silent for a minute, and then she just kind of muttered to herself, I just can't get away from this man. He's killing me all over again. But despite being dealt such an unfair hand in life, Carol was determined to not let her injuries or her illness define her. And so she went out looking for a job that could accommodate her physical limitations, and she found it. She was hired as a part-time customer service rep for a television cable company. She was very happy about this job and very proud of it because it was the first time she was working after the attack, and so for once it felt like her life was going back to normal again. A few years later, in 2000, when Carol was working at the cable company, her phone rang and she answered it the way she answered every other call, but the voice she heard on the other end, she immediately recognized. He introduced himself as Reggie Sumner, and so Carol asked him, are you the Reggie Sumner from 1962 at Garrett High School in South Carolina? And he said, yeah, that's me. And Carol said, I'm your ex-girlfriend. We dated in high school. And so it was this incredible reunion, this totally chance phone call. And for the next hour or so, they just chatted on the phone about everything from their kids to their relationships they've been in to what they're up to now. I mean, they had a lot to catch up on since they hadn't seen or heard from each other in nearly 40 years. And so before they hung up, they realized they lived near each other, and so they made plans to get together in person. Rhonda would say her mother, when she came home that night, was like a 16-year-old girl all over again. She talked endlessly about how great Reggie was and how good-looking he was and how excited she was about their upcoming date. And so a couple of days later, Carol and Reggie have this date, and when Carol comes home, Rhonda would say it was obvious her mother had fallen head over heels in love with Reggie all over again. And luckily, Reggie had fallen in love with Carol too, because less than 6 months later, they got married and became Mr. and Mrs. Sumner. Within a year of their marriage, they decided to sell their home in South Carolina and move to Jacksonville, Florida to retire. Even though caring for her mother for all those years had been quite difficult for Rhonda, she said she was very sad to see her mother go, but at the same time, she was really happy for her because it seemed like she had found the one. Over the next couple of years, Rhonda stayed in touch with her mother, speaking to her almost every single day on the phone. But in July of 2005, Rhonda's mother stopped answering her phone. At first, Rhonda wasn't that concerned, but after 24 hours of not hearing from her mother or from Reggie, she did get concerned. Because even though Reggie was able to care for Carol, he wasn't in the best shape himself. He had debilitating diabetes, and he had recently broken his leg, and so was largely confined to a wheelchair. And so if they were to leave their house for an extended period of time, they wouldn't do it without asking for help from Rhonda. And so over the next couple of days, Rhonda incessantly called her mother and called Reggie, but she never got through to them. And so finally, after almost 72 hours of not hearing from them, she decides to just hop in her car and drive the 4 hours to Jacksonville to check on them personally. When she got there, she saw her mother and Reggie's car was not in the driveway like it normally would be. And so Rhonda went up to the front door and she knocked and she's yelling for her mom, but nobody's coming to the door, even though lights are on inside the house. And so Rhonda eventually tries the handle of the door and it's open. And so she opens it up, she steps inside, she yells again for her mom and for Reggie, but no one yells back. And then she sees their beloved dog, Mikey, that they brought everywhere with them, was still in the house. And so she's thinking, where would they have gone without bringing Mikey? And so Rhonda continues to walk through the house into the kitchen. And when she gets there, she sees on the table are 2 plates of food where the food looks like it's a couple of days old and it's just sitting on the plate like they had been eating it and then just abandoned it there. And then in the sink are all these dirty dishes. And then on the stove are half-cooked pots of food. And Rhonda knows her mother is an extremely tidy person and she never would have left her house with dirty dishes and food out on the table. And so red flags are going up for Rhonda. But what ultimately sealed the deal for her was when she turned and looked on one of the counters, she saw the cell phone that Reggie and Carol shared was still sitting there along with Carol's purse. And then next to that was both of their medications, which was Reggie's insulin and Carol's liver cancer medication, both of which were life-saving and needed to be taken every single day. There's no way they would have left the house without those things. And so Rhonda immediately calls the Jacksonville Police Department and she files a missing person report. And before long, the missing couple's story story is all over the news, and all of the networks are asking people if they have information to come forward. But no one came forward, and so the only lead the police had was to track down the Sumners' car, which was missing from their driveway when Rhonda showed up at their house. So the police shared the description of their vehicle all across the state, and very quickly they got a hit. The car had been found abandoned in a Florida town about 1 hour west of Jacksonville. It had been parked in this semi-forested, very secluded area off of a dirt road, and there was nothing inside of it, but they saw the battery had been taken out, leading some of the officers to speculate that perhaps the Sumners really had just driven away from their home without telling anybody and then ran into car troubles. But that theory would quickly be thrown out the window when 5 hours later, the Jacksonville police received a very strange phone call. The man who called in said he was Reggie Sumner, and he said he had seen the news about him and his wife being missing and that was just totally not true, that in reality they had left, but they were just fine and they'd be back soon. The police are immediately suspicious of this person. They don't think it's Reggie Sumner because, for one, he sounds like a young man and Reggie is a 61-year-old, and so the voice didn't really line up, and just the way he was talking about this disappearance like it was no big deal, that also just didn't really make sense. And so one of the officers asked Reggie, "Are you with your wife Carol?" And he said, "Yep, I'm with her, here she is." And so a woman hops on the phone who says she's Carol Sumner, but she sounds far too young to be Carol Sumner, who's 61. This sounds like a 18, 19, 20-year-old girl, and she too just reiterates that everything's just fine and they've gone out for a couple of days, there's nothing to worry about, and you police can stop looking for us. And so after this call ends, the police at this point are convinced that this simply cannot be Carol and Reggie. But to make sure, they call in Rhonda and they have her listen to the recording of this conversation with the so-called Reggie and Carol, and right away Rhonda says, "That's not my mom and that's not Reggie." And so at this point, the police assumed that these two people who called in pretending to be the Sumners probably had something to do with the disappearance of the real Sumners. And so while they waited for the trace on this phone call to come back, which would give them information about who was calling and from where, the police decided to investigate another angle. The police looked at the Sumners' bank statements and they saw their bank card had been used at an ATM in South Carolina after the Sumners had been reported missing. And so they called that bank and they asked for the CCTV footage from that ATM. And when they watched it, they saw that it was not Carol or Reggie Sumner withdrawing funds. It was some unknown man in his early 20s. Right after this discovery of this unknown man, the trace from the phone conversation with the imposter Sumners came back, except it was tied to a fake name at a fake address. So that wasn't helpful to the police in their investigation. However, when they went through this cell phone's call logs, which they got with the phone trace, they saw whoever owned the cell phone had recently placed a call to a car rental company in South Carolina. And so the police call this car rental company and they speak to the manager and they're able to figure out that somebody using this cell phone number had indeed called and had rented a car, and the car they rented matched the description of the car the unknown man was driving in the ATM surveillance footage. But this car had been rented to a woman. Her name was Tiffany Cole. The rental company told police that all of their cars had satellite tracking information built into them. And so police were able to use that information to track Tiffany's rental car to a motel in South Carolina. The initial thought was that maybe the Sumners are being held against their will in this motel. And so very quickly, a police force was organized, and on the morning of July 14th, so 6 days after the Sumners were listed as missing, they arrive at this motel, they go to the front desk, they find out what room Tiffany is in, they get the key, and they go up and they open the door. The Sumners were not inside. Instead, there were 3 young adults sitting there. It was 24-year-old Tiffany Cole, her boyfriend, 23-year-old Michael James Jackson, and his friend, 19-year-old Alan Wade. Also in the room were dozens of bags of recently purchased merchandise, like computers and video games and clothes and perfume, and also they discovered the key to the Sumners' vehicle and Reggie Sumner's prized coin collection. The police brought all 3 back to the police station and put them in separate rooms to be interrogated. At this point, it was obvious to police that these 3 had something to do with the Sumners' disappearance. They had all these things in the room that tied them to the missing couple. And so now the police, as they interrogated them, it was not so much about connecting them to the Sumners as much as it was about helping them find the Sumners. At first, all 3 of them either didn't talk or were totally uncooperative. But under intense questioning, Tiffany cracked a little bit. She said that they had robbed the Sumners, but nothing more. They didn't do anything else besides rob them. And there had been a fourth person involved in the robbery, 19-year-old Bruce Nixon, who was friends with Alan Wade. Bruce lived nearby, so the police quickly rounded him up and brought him in for questioning, and unlike the other three, Bruce immediately caved. And the story he told about what happened to the Sumners brought many of the police that were involved in this investigation to tears. He said it all started with Tiffany. Tiffany used to be neighbors with the Sumners back when they still lived in South Carolina. Tiffany had a pretty rough upbringing and her father was permanently sick. And so the Sumners kind of took her under their wing and looked after her and built a very close relationship with her and kind of treated her like she was one of their daughters. Anything she needed, if she needed money, food, anything, they would give it to her. For example, in 2001, right before they left for Florida, they sold a car to Tiffany, but they sold it for basically nothing because they knew she didn't have any money and she really needed a car. 4 years later, in June of 2005, Tiffany was partying in Jacksonville, Florida with her new boyfriend, Michael James Jackson, when they got kicked out of the house they planned on staying in for the night. And so now they don't have a place to stay, they don't have any money, and that's when Tiffany remembers the Sumners had moved to Jacksonville and they would always help her out if she needed anything. And so the two of them drive to the Sumners' house in the middle of the night, they haven't called them, and they just knock on the door, totally uninvited, and Carol comes to the door, and when she opens it, she sees Tiffany, and immediately she's like, "Oh my goodness, I haven't seen you in so long. Come in, come in. Who are you? Oh, Michael, great to meet you. Come on inside. I'll get you food. We'll get you fed. What do you need? What can we do for you?" And so that's when Tiffany explains to them that their plans had kind of fallen through and they didn't have a place to stay that night, and would it be possible to stay with them? And so Carol and Reggie right away say, "Absolutely no problem. Tiffany, Michael, you guys are guests here. You're welcome. Stay as long as you want." And so that night, Carol cooked a big meal for them and they all sat down at the table. And at some point, Carol and Reggie talk about the sale of their house in South Carolina, and somehow it came up that they had made $99,000 in profit from this sale. And they were so happy about it because now they could really retire comfortably. And so as soon as they said that, Tiffany and Michael shot glances at each other because they knew they had to come back and rob them. The next morning, Carol and Reggie got up early, they made coffee and they made breakfast, and they were hoping that Tiffany and Michael would stick around for the day and spend some more time with them. But Tiffany and Michael were very quick to want to leave. They said, "Thank you very much, we got to hit the road." And so they left. And as soon as they get in the car, they start planning how they're going to come back and rob the Sumners and get their hands on that $99,000. 1 month later, on the evening of July 8th, after all robbery preparations have been made, Bruce Nixon and Alan Wade show up at the Sumner house and they knock on the door. When the door opens, it's Carol, and she doesn't recognize either of them, but being as kind and generous as she was, she said, "Hey boys, what can I do for you? How can I help you?" And this was exactly what Bruce and Alan were expecting based on what Tiffany told them. She said this couple would be very easy to exploit. And they tell her that their car had broken down and they needed to use her phone. And so she's a little bit skeptical, but ultimately she says, "Sure, come on in." And so Bruce and Alan go inside the house, the door shuts behind them, and as soon as it does, one of them draws a fake gun that looks very real and pointed it at Carol, while the other one began tying her up with cord and with duct tape. And so Carol begins screaming and making a bunch of noise, and Reggie, who's in the garage out of sight, he hears her. He comes running in to see what's going on, and he sees these two men who immediately attack him, and Reggie's got a broken leg and he's already pretty weak and frail, and so he doesn't put up much of a fight. And before long, he and his wife were all taped up and restrained on the couch, and they were having duct tape wrapped around their heads until everything was covered except for a slit underneath their nose so they could breathe. And so with the couple completely under control and at the mercy of their captors, one of the men texted Michael, who was down the road with Tiffany inside of Tiffany's rental car, and the text just said, "All clear." And what that meant was Michael could now come up and help them rob the house. And so Tiffany stays down the road in the rental car. Michael makes his way up. He goes inside, and he, Bruce, and Alan proceeded to ransack the house. And while these three men are moving room to room, taking all of their valuables, Reggie and Carol are probably thinking to themselves that, you know what, this is awful, we're getting robbed, but after they take whatever they take and they leave, we'll be fine, we'll recover. But when these three men finish taking all of their valuable items, they decided that they would also take Reggie and Carol. So they stood the couple up and they marched them into the garage and they put them in the trunk of their own car. At this point, Bruce left the Sumners' house and went down the road and got in Tiffany's rental car, and Michael and Alan, they got into the Sumners' car, and the two cars met up on the road and then drove 40 minutes northwest just over the border into Georgia, where they found this access road and they went down it until they reached this very secluded section of forest. This was not just some random spot in the middle of the woods in Georgia. This was a pre-selected spot that Tiffany and the others had been out to 2 days earlier to prepare it. And what they had done to prepare was to dig a grave for the Sumners. Michael and Alan, in the Sumners' car, drove up right next to the grave site, while Tiffany and Bruce came up right behind them. And once they had all stopped, they got out of the car and they went right behind the Sumners' car and they popped open the trunk. It's believed the temperature inside of that trunk was well over 100 degrees. And so Reggie and Carol were sweating profusely, and the sweat had caused their restraints to slip off their wrists and slip down off their face. And so the two of them were found holding on to each other and crying and praying. Seeing how weak they already were, the group decided they did not need to put new tape around their wrists or their face. They weren't going to go anywhere. And so they grabbed the two and they pulled them out and dumped them on the ground. It was probably around this time that the Sumners realized Tiffany was one of these 4 people that was doing this horrible thing to them. And I can only imagine the heartbreak they experienced. This girl that they took in under their wing, that they thought of as a daughter, was betraying them in such a heinous and horrible way. But there was no time to feel upset about it, because as soon as they were dumped on the ground, Michael grabbed Reggie and kind of threw him over to the side and said, "Sit down, don't move, or I'm going to kill you and your wife." And then the others grabbed Carol and dragged her away from her husband over to the edge of the grave, where they literally ripped the jewelry off of her face and off of her body. And then after all the jewelry was gone, they pushed her into the grave. Then they walked over to Reggie and dragged him over and threw him in with his wife. As soon as the couple was in the grave together, they repositioned themselves so they were both sitting up, one in front of the other, with Carol behind Reggie, and she threw her legs and her arms around Reggie, just kind of clutching onto him, and she buried her head into his back and she began crying. The original plan, apparently, had been to take the Sumners and put them in this grave and pretend like you were going to do something to them, to scare them into giving up all of their information, all of their banking information, and anything else that was valuable. And it worked. And so as Carol is crying into Reggie's back, Reggie is pleading with the group. He's pleading to them, "Let me give you everything I have. Whatever you need, it's yours." And so Michael said, "Give me all your ATM bank card numbers, give me your PIN numbers, everything." And so Reggie did. He gave him all the information he could possibly give to him. And then, for some reason, despite the fact that at this point, the group has taken everything of value from this poor couple, they have extracted all the valuable information they could possibly get from them. Despite that, they decide that that's not enough. They need to kill the Sumners. And they need to kill them in the worst way imaginable. They need to bury them alive. For hours, the group slowly, shovelful by shovelful, filled in this hole with Reggie and Carol sitting at the bottom begging for their lives. But the group didn't care at all. They just kept shoveling dirt down on top of them until the dirt and mud had gotten up to their necks, and the weight of the dirt was pressing in on their chests and was making it really hard to breathe. And so as Carol and Reggie are feeling this happening to them, they can feel themselves being crushed under this weight. Their cries for help become more and more desperate, but more spaced apart, because their breathing at this point is so labored, it's so hard to get a full breath that they're conserving their air at this point. And then at some point, as the dirt crept closer and closer to their mouths, they had to tilt their heads up to try to get a good breath of air. But when they did that, they began shoveling dirt directly onto their faces, causing them to choke and gag. They're inhaling this, and it's becoming nearly impossible to catch a breath. They're dying at this point. And so finally, another layer of dirt was thrown on top of them and they disappeared under the soil. But their sounds didn't go away. They continued to whimper and make sounds as more and more dirt was put down, until finally they had filled in the hole and they began packing the dirt down with the backs of their shovels. And they could hear underneath the soil still the sounds of this couple dying. This was a slow and horrible death. After the killers were done, they left the site and they took the Sumner's car and they dumped it in Florida, where it was ultimately found. And then they all piled into the rental car. They went to an ATM and pulled some of the Sumner's money out and then went on a spending spree. Here is a photo of Tiffany celebrating just hours after killing the very people that had taken her in and treated her like a daughter. After their autopsies, the medical examiner explained that both Reggie and Carol had dirt packed into their nose, into their mouths, in their throats, in their stomach, and in their lungs, meaning their actual cause of death was being buried alive. In exchange for telling investigators what happened and for leading them to the gravesite where the Sumners were, Bruce Nixon was spared the death penalty and given a life sentence. As for Michael, Alan, and Tiffany, they were all sentenced to death.